Experimental film, experimental cinema, or avant-garde cinema is a mode of filmmaking that rigorously re-evaluates cinematic conventions and explores non-narrative forms or alternatives to traditional narratives or methods of working. Many experimental films, particularly early ones, relate to arts in other disciplines, painting, dance, literature, and poetry, or arise from research and development of new technical resources. While some experimental films have been distributed through mainstream channels or even made within commercial studios, the vast majority have been produced on very low budgets with a minimal crew or a single person and are either self-financed or supported through small grants. Experimental filmmakers generally begin as amateurs, and some use experimental films as a springboard into commercial filmmaking or transition into academic positions. The aim of experimental filmmaking may be to render the personal vision of an artist, or to promote interest in new technology rather than to entertain or to generate revenue, as is the case with commercial films. Definition: the term describes a range of filmmaking styles that are generally quite different from, and often opposed to, the practices of mainstream commercial and documentary filmmaking. Avant-garde is also used, for the films shot in the 20s in the field of histories of avant-garde's currents in France, Germany, or Russia, to describe this work, and underground was used in the 60s, though it has also had other connotations. Today the term experimental cinema prevails, because it's possible to make experimental films without the presence of any avant-garde movement in the cultural field. While experimental covers a wide range of practice, an experimental film is often characterized by the absence of linear narrative, the use of various abstracting techniques out of focus, painting or scratching on film, rapid editing, the use of asynchronous, non-diegetic, sound, or even the absence of any soundtrack. The goal is often to place the viewer in a more active and more thoughtful relationship to the film. At least through the 1960s, and to some extent after, many experimental films took an oppositional stance toward mainstream culture. Most such films are made on very low budgets, self-financed or financed through small grants, with a minimal crew or, often a crew of only one person, the filmmaker. Some critics have argued that much experimental film is no longer in fact experimental but has in fact become a mainstream film genre. Many of its more typical features, such as a non-narrative, impressionistic, or poetic approaches to the film's construction, define what is generally understood to be experimental. Experimental film in universities. With very few exceptions, Curtis Harrington among them, the artists involved in these early movements remained outside the mainstream commercial cinema and entertainment industry. A few taught occasionally, and then, starting in 1966, many became professors at universities such as the State Universities of New York, Bard College, California Institute of the Arts, the Massachusetts College of Art, University of Colorado at Boulder, and the San Francisco Art Institute. Many of the practitioners of experimental film do not in fact possess college degrees themselves, although their showings are prestigious. Some have questioned the status of the films made in the academy, but longtime film professors such as Stan Brakhage, Ken Jacobs, Ernie Jair, and many others, continued to refine and expand their practice while teaching. The inclusion of experimental film in film courses and standard film histories, however, has made the work more widely known and more accessible. Influences on mainstream commercial media. Though experimental film is known to a relatively small number of practitioners, academics, and connoisseurs, it has influenced and continues to influence cinematography, visual effects, and editing. The genre of music video can be seen as a commercialization of many techniques of experimental film. Title design and television advertising have also been influenced by experimental film. Many experimental filmmakers have also made feature films, and vice versa. Exhibition and distribution. Lithuanian artist Jonas Mekas, regarded as godfather of American avant-garde cinema. Beginning in 1946, Frank Stoffaker ran the Art in Cinema program of experimental and avant-garde films at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. From 1949 to 1975, the Festival International du Cinéma Expérimental de Nuuk-El Izud, located in Nuuk Heist, Belgium was the most prominent festival of experimental cinema in the world. It permits the discovery of American avant-garde in 1958 with Brakhage films and many others European and American filmmakers. From 1947 to 1963, the New York-based Cinema 16 functioned as the primary exhibitor and distributor of experimental film in the United States. Under the leadership of Amos Vogel and Marcia Vogel, Cinema 16 flourished as a non-profit membership society committed to the exhibition of documentary, avant-garde, scientific, educational, and performance films to ever-increasing audiences. In 1962, Jonas Mekas and about 20 other filmmakers founded the Filmmakers Cooperative in New York City. Soon similar artists' cooperatives were formed in other places, Canyon Cinema in San Francisco, the London Filmmakers Co-op, and Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Centre. Following the model of Cinema 16, experimental films have been exhibited mainly outside of commercial theaters in small film societies, microcinemas, museums, art galleries, archives, and film festivals. Several other organizations in both Europe and North America helped develop experimental film. These included Anthology Film Archives in New York City, the Millennium Film Workshop, the British Film Institute in London, the National Film Board of Canada and the Collective for Living Cinema. Some of the more popular film festivals, such as Ann Arbor Film Festival, the New York Film Festival's Views from the Avant-Garde Sidebar, the International Film Festival Rotterdam, and Media City Film Festival prominently feature experimental works. The New York Underground Film Festival, Chicago Underground Film Festival, the LA Free Waves Experimental Media Arts Festival, Mix NYC, the New York Experimental Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, and Toronto's Images Festival also support this work and provide venues for films which would not otherwise be seen. There is some dispute about whether underground and avant-garde truly mean the same thing and if challenging non-traditional cinema and fine art cinema are actually fundamentally related. Venues such as Anthology Film Archives, San Francisco Cinematheque, Pacific Film Archive in Berkeley, California, Tate Modern, London and the Centre Pompidou in Paris often include historically significant experimental films and contemporary works. Screening series no longer in New York that featured experimental work include the Robert Beck Memorial Cinema, Ocularis, and the Collective for Living Cinema. All these associations and movements have permitted the birth and development of national experimental films and schools like Body Cinema, Écoles du Corps or Cinéma Corporel, and post-structural movements in France, and structural/materialism in England, for example. The Brakhage Centre, created in 2005, is named after Stan Brakhage, 1933 to 2003, one of the most innovative and influential filmmakers of the 20th century who was also Distinguished Professor of Film Studies at CU Boulder. A prolific filmmaker, he made nearly 350 films in his 52-year-long career that include psychodramas, autobiographical films, Freudian trance films, song cycles, birth films, meditations on light, and hand-painted films. They range in duration from 9 seconds to over 4 hours and cover every technical format from Super 8mm to 70mm IMAX. The center is dedicated to keeping alive Brakhage legacy by promoting creativity, experimentation, and critical inquiry into the media arts. Among its various activities, it hosts a symposium in March as well as a speaker series in fall. It works closely with Norlin Archives on campus, which houses Brakhage's papers and correspondence as well as a print of every film he made. The center and the archive constitute an invaluable resource for Brakhage scholars and students as well as lovers of experimental cinema.